Hello. Okay. Hello, everyone. So, as Alistair said, this is my honors research, and we were just interested in seeing if planting speckworm as part of restoration allowed or restored the ecosystem to a point that it would recruit small mammals back into the ecosystem, and then we were comparing that to intact, thicket, and degraded. Okay. So, as we all know, Albany Thicket has been severely degraded due to historical livestock management, and in order to, or, and to restore, sorry, and because the system was degraded, restoration projects were established. For example, the Subtropical Thicket Restoration Program. So this program was established in 2005, and part of this program involved planting over 300 of these 50-meter by 50-meter thicket-wide plots of speckworm. So these plots were planted across the eastern and western Capes in degraded areas of Albany Thicket, and yeah, they were planted between 2008 and 2009. So in the process of restoration, you're taking a degraded system and shifting it towards a state that is hopefully more intact or close to pristine thicket. So this involves the process of ecological succession. So with ecological succession, in the early stages, you find that your system is very degraded, it's very disturbed. And as ecological succession progresses into the later stages, it becomes closer to that intact sort of state. So in the early stages of ecological succession, we expect to see more generalist species. So for example, Arnatal multimammate mouse over there. And as the system progresses into the later stages of ecological succession, we expect to see more specialist species like the Western rock elephant shrew. So keeping this in mind, we can then use small mammals as our indicators of ecological succession stage and then link this to ecosystem health. So this was the study site. It was on a private game farm called Kuduspoort that was just outside of Kirkwood, and this is what it looked like in 1939. And this is what it looked like in 2022, so last year. And you can see how that nice continuous canopy is no more, unfortunately. You can also see that there's this sort of little square here, and that is a thicket-wide plot from the Subtropical Thicket Restoration Program. So for my study, we're looking at 3 different states of thicket. We're looking at a near intact area up on a hill over there, and we called this speckworm dominated because it included the thicket-wide plot, so the restoration. And then I grouped in a small bush clump that was near it because it had a very high density of speckworm. So their vegetative composition was similar. So that's the speckworm dominated area. And we also looked at the degraded matrix in between. So before was an aerial image, but let's take a look at a ground view. So you can see the degraded, it's very open. It has a lot of ephemeral succulents, and you can see that there's not too much going on. But in the speckworm dominated, so that picture was in the thicket wide plot, and you can see that there's a lot of speckworm, and it's a bit more dense. And in the near intact thicket, you can see that there's speckworm and other plants in the mix, and you can see how dense it is compared to the degraded. So just looking at these pictures, you can get an idea of that ecological succession process moving from the degraded into the near intact. So to monitor these areas, I built trap units, which were basically a wooden box, and they had a camera strap to one side, and we had some bait there to attract the small mammals. So we deployed these camera traps or trap units on the 7th of June, and we placed 5 of them in the near intact, a total of 5 spread over the speckworm dominated areas, and then 6 throughout the degraded matrix. We then moved these around on the 11th of July in case some animals had become territorial and they were stopping other animals from getting a snack. So the big question, what did we see? Well, we saw a lot of unexpected guests that weren't small mammals. We saw some deka, hoopoes, southern bobo. The birds love the camera, by the way. And monkeys, lots of monkeys. They really liked the taste of my bait. We also saw a familiar chat flying away there. And like I said, this was on a private game farm, so the kudu joined in as well in the buffet. We see a small spotted genet there, and there were, well, I don't know if it was many porcupines, but there were some porcupines that loved the taste of my bait and also my boxes because they took a chunk out of one. There's also the bokmakiri. We saw a jackal once. There's also the kudu again, and a scrub bear. So anyways, back to the small mammals. So in the degraded area, we saw a total of 5 small mammal species. So we had the striped polecat, a Cape short-tailed gerbil, a meerkat, which we only saw once, a Natal multi-mammate mouse, and a tiny pygmy mouse. Oh wait, sorry, go back. So the Cape short-tailed gerbil and the meerkat were only seen in the degraded area. In the speckworm-dominated area, we saw 6 small mammal species. We saw a Cape grey mongoose, a western rock elephant shrew, and a mackerel rock mouse, striped polecat, Natal multi-mammate mouse, and again a tiny pygmy mouse. In the near-intact area, we saw 7 small mammal species, 6 of these being the same ones that we saw in the speckworm-dominated area, plus the addition of a house mouse. And the reason why that picture looks so strange is because the camera was flipped upside down by porcupines. So we only saw one specialist species in the area, and that was the western rock elephant shrew. So these little guys are specialists because they eat only insects, and they are found only in the rocky areas. And these little guys were only seen in the spectrum-dominated and intact areas, not the degraded areas. So, expectation versus reality. What did we expect to see going into this? So, in terms of small mammal species richness, we thought that the near-intact area would have the most small mammal species, followed by the spectrum-dominated, and then the degraded area. However, what we really saw was that statistically, the near-intact area and the spectrum-dominated area didn't differ. They were very similar, and that these two areas were actually different to the degraded area. And in terms of small mammal species composition, we thought that the near-intact would have mostly specialist species, we thought that the degraded would have mostly generalists, and that the spectrum-dominated area would be somewhere in between. However, what we really saw was that the near-intact and the spectrum-dominated areas shared that one specialist, and that the degraded area had only generalists. So what does this mean? So quick recap, the near-intact and spectrum-dominated area were similar to each other in terms of small mammal species richness, and in terms of species composition, the near-intact and spectrum-dominated areas were different to the degraded area. So this shows that by planting the speckworm, by planting the speckworm, that restored area or the speckworm-dominated area was able to recruit in the same small mammals that we saw in the near-intact area. So this meant that they were serving the same ecological function. And this means that the subtropical thicket restoration program was a success in terms of this thicket white plot. So what's next? We need more replicates. So I only looked at one thicket white plot on one farm. So in order for this data to be more statistically significant, I'm going to need to look at, or we're going to need to compare other thicket white plots to other areas of thicket in other farms to see if the small animal species or community is the same. And this sort of study can serve as a baseline for that. Thank you.